Welcome, dear readers, to a story that defies the conventions of the heart. In the golden meadows of Montana, where the wind whispers secrets among the endless prairies, we will meet Mary Elizabeth Sullivan, a refined lady who will discover that true love can bloom in the most unexpected places. Where are you joining us from today? From what corner of the world is your heart preparing for this emotional journey? Don't forget to subscribe and leave your like if this story manages to touch the deepest fibers of your soul. Now allow me to transport you. Year 1883. Willow Creek, Montana, United States. The August sun fell like golden honey over the endless prairies when the stagecoach stopped with a creak of wood and metal on the only street in Willow Creek. Among the clouds of dust that rose like incense toward the clear sky emerged a figure that seemed to have been plucked from a Charleston salon, Mary Elizabeth Sullivan. Her emerald green silk skirts swayed like willow leaves as she descended from the carriage, and the wide-brimmed hat that protected her face couldn't hide the elegance that emanated from each of her movements. The town stopped. Hammers fell silent. In the smithy, conversations suspended on the general store's porch, and even the dogs seemed to hold their breath. James Harper, who was mending the fence of his ranch on the outskirts of town, watched from a distance. William Sullivan's telegram had arrived 3 days earlier. "Take care of my sister. Arriving Tuesday. Urgent business keeps me in Denver. I trust you, friend." But William hadn't mentioned that his sister was this creature of porcelain and silks who seemed more like a mirage than a woman of flesh and blood. Mary Elizabeth breathed deeply, inhaling the aroma of dry earth horse manure and something wild she couldn't identify. Charleston smelled of magnolias and salt water. This smelled of freedom and something vaguely dangerous that made her heart race, in ways she didn't understand. "Miss Sullivan." The rough voice startled her. She turned and found herself facing a man who seemed to have been carved by the same wind that shaped Montana's rocks. James Harper was tall, with broad shoulders that knew hard work, and eyes the color of the sky before a storm. His wide-brimmed hat cast shadows over a face that spoke of voluntary solitudes and chosen silences. "Mr. Harper, I presume." Her voice had the musical accent of the South, soft as the murmur of a stream. He nodded, taking her luggage without ceremony. Mary Elizabeth noticed how his hands weathered and strong-handled her delicate bags as if they were sacred. There was something in his movements that spoke of a gentleness carefully guarded under layers of acquired roughness. "William said you need a place to stay." The words came from him like someone pulling rusty nails from old wood. "Temporarily," she hurried to clarify, adjusting her parasol against the harsh sun. "Just until my brother returns from Denver." James studied her with those eyes that seemed to see more than she was willing to show. There was something fragile in the way she maintained her perfect posture, something brittle in the smile she offered like a shield. "I'll take you to Mrs. McKinnon's house. She has lodging." He turned toward his horse, but she stopped him with a gloved hand on his arm. The contact was like the spark of electricity before lightning. Both felt it, both pretended not to notice. "Mr. Harper," she began, but the words tangled in her throat when he looked directly at her. In those eyes were stories she wanted to read, solitudes she recognized because she had her own. "Yes, miss." But Mary Elizabeth had already lost the thread of what she wanted to say. Montana's heat, so different from Charleston's humid embrace, enveloped her like an unspoken promise. "Nothing. Just, thank you." As they walked down the main street, Mary Elizabeth felt the town's eyes fixed on her like pins. Women peered from windows, whispering behind faded cotton curtains. Men tipped their hats with a reverence she didn't know whether to interpret as respect or curiosity. Mrs. Rose McKinnon appeared at her boarding house door as if she had been waiting. She was a middle-aged woman with eyes sharp as a hawk's and a smile that promised delicious gossip. "Miss Sullivan, what a joy to have you in our little town." Her voice had the honeyed tone of someone who had found gold in the river of monotony. Mary Elizabeth smiled, but her eyes instinctively sought James, who was already moving away with firm steps toward his horse. Something in his silence disturbed her, as if he were a closed book she desperately needed to read. "Mr. Harper," she called to him, not knowing why. He stopped, turned slowly. In the distance, separating them, something invisible vibrated like a violin string. I hope to see you soon." James touched the brim of his hat in a gesture that was pure Western courtesy, but in his eyes was something that made Mary Elizabeth feel as if the solid ground of Willow Creek had become quicksand beneath her feet. What secrets did this solitary man guard, and why had her brother trusted him to care for her? The days in Willow Creek passed with the slowness of honey in winter. Mary Elizabeth had discovered that Mrs. McKinnon's boarding house was comfortable but noisy. The floorboards creaked at every step, and the walls were so thin she could hear the other guests' conversations as if they were in her own room. But what disturbed her most wasn't the noise, but James Harper's silence. A week had passed since her arrival, and he had fulfilled the basic obligations of a host. He made sure she had everything necessary, accompanied her to see the town introduced, her to Reverend Samuel Porter and Dr. Williams. But he did everything with such formal courtesy that he seemed to be serving a sentence. This morning, however, things had taken an unexpected turn. Mary Elizabeth had decided she needed fresh air and had walked to James's ranch carrying a basket with freshly baked bread she had convinced Mrs. McKinnon to let her make. The aroma of warm dough mixed with the lavender perfume she had brought from Charleston, creating a fragrance that belonged neither to the east nor the west. She found him in the corral training a wild colt. The animal was beautiful and temperamental, with a black mane that flew like silk in the wind. James moved with breathtaking grace, anticipating the horse's every movement, responding to its rebellion with infinite patience. Mary Elizabeth approached, the fence mesmerized. She had never seen anything so primitive and beautiful at the same time. In Charleston, horses were domesticated creatures that pulled elegant carriages. This was different, pure vital force negotiating with human will. The colt neighed and reared up on its hind legs. Mary Elizabeth held her breath, but James never lost his balance. When the animal calmed down, he stroked its neck with a tenderness that startled her. "It's beautiful," she said, not realizing she had spoken aloud. James turned surprised. He hadn't heard her arrive. On his face for a moment, she saw something defenseless, vulnerability, surprise, and something else that made her heart flutter like leaves in a storm. "Miss Sullivan." His voice sounded hoarse from exertion. "I wasn't expecting you." "I brought bread." She raised the basket as evidence, feeling ridiculously shy. "I thought that you might be hungry." James approached the fence, and Mary Elizabeth noticed how his shirt stuck to his chest with sweat. There was something deeply masculine in his appearance that made her feel strangely vulnerable, as if her silk dresses were armor too fragile for this place. "That's very kind." He took the basket, and their fingers brushed briefly. Again, that electric spark that neither mentioned. May I watch you work?" she asked, surprising herself. James studied her as if she were a mystery he couldn't solve. "It's no place for a lady." There was something in the way he said "lady" that made her frown, not as a compliment, but as a limitation. "I'm stronger than I look, Mr. Harper." "I don't doubt it, but strength isn't the only thing that matters here." They looked at each other over the wooden fence, and Mary Elizabeth felt that something important was being decided in that charged silence. The wind moved her skirt, carrying her lavender scent to him, and she saw how his nostrils dilated slightly, as if he were memorizing the aroma. "Very well," he said finally, "but stay at the fence." For the next hour, Mary Elizabeth watched fascinated as James worked with the colt. It was like witnessing an ancient dance, a wordless dialogue between two beings who spoke different languages but understood each other on a primordial level. When James finally stopped, both were drenched in sweat, he from effort, she from the intensity of watching. "How do you do it?" she asked, genuinely curious. "How do you know what he's going to do before he does it?" James leaned against the fence. So close she could see the sweat drops on his forehead, the small lines around his eyes that spoke of years looking at distant horizons. "You learn to listen," he said simply. "Horses don't lie. They're honest in their fear, honest in their trust. And people." The question came out before she could stop it. James looked at her with an intensity that made her feel naked. "People. People are more complicated. There was something in his voice that suggested painful experiences, disappointments, that had left invisible scars. Mary Elizabeth felt an almost irresistible impulse to touch him, to offer some kind of comfort, but she restrained herself. "Mr. Harper," she began, but he had already moved away. "You should return to town, Miss Sullivan. Mrs. McKinnon will worry." It was an excuse, and both knew it. But Mary Elizabeth nodded, took her empty basket, and headed for the trail that led to town. Halfway there, she turned around. James was still at the fence, watching her walk away. Even at that distance, she could feel the weight of his gaze like a caress. That night in her room at the boarding house, Mary Elizabeth found herself looking out the window toward the ranch, wondering what secrets James Harper kept in his solitary heart, and why each encounter with him left her feeling as if she were awakening from a lifelong dream. How is it possible that a man so silent filled so much space in her thoughts? The morning air of Willow Creek carried the scent of dew-dampened grass when Mary Elizabeth headed to the general store. She had developed a routine in the past too. Week's breakfast with Mrs. McKinnon, who took advantage of every moment to probe for information about her life in Charleston, a walk through town to acclimate, as she put it, and then a visit to the store to buy small things she didn't really need. The truth was, she hoped to encounter James. Their meetings had been brief but significant. He continued to be a man of few words, but Mary Elizabeth had learned to read the nuances in his silences. There were comfortable silences when they shared. The bench in front of the church at sunset, charged silences when their gazes met by chance on the street, and tense silences when she asked questions that touched personal territories he kept carefully protected. This morning, however, fate had other plans for her. "Miss Sullivan," the voice echoed through the entire main street like a shot. Mary Elizabeth turned and saw Charles Whitmore approaching, mounted on a glossy black horse that had clearly cost more than most of Willow Creek's inhabitants earned in a year. Charles was the banker's son, a young man of 27 with ambitions that far exceeded Montana's limits. "Mr. Whitmore," she responded with the courtesy her southern upbringing had instilled in her, although something in his too-perfect smile put her on alert. Charles dismounted with a theatrical flourish that suggested years of practice in front of the mirror. His suit was impeccable, his mustache carefully waxed, and his boots shone like puddles after rain. In any Charleston salon, he would have been considered an excellent catch. Here in the middle of Montana's raw earth, he seemed slightly absurd. "Allow me to tell you that you are like a rose among thorns in our humble town," he said, taking her gloved hand and kissing it with exaggerated reverence. Mary Elizabeth felt slight disgust, not at the gesture itself, but at the calculated way he performed it, as if it were a move in a chess game. "You're very kind, Mr. Whitmore." "Charles, please." His smile widened. "I hope you might consider that we are friends." There was something in the way he said "friends" that suggested intentions going far beyond friendship. Mary Elizabeth had known enough men like Charles in Charleston, handsome, charming on the surface, but with an arrogance that made them believe the world owed them everything they desired. "Of course," she replied, maintaining her diplomatic smile. "Excellent. In that case, I would like to know if you would care to accompany me on a picnic this Sunday. There's a beautiful place by the river, very appropriate for a lady of your refinement." Before Mary Elizabeth could respond, a shadow fell over them. James Harper had appeared as if he had emerged from the earth itself, carrying supplies toward his wagon. His presence immediately changed the conversation's dynamic. "Whitmore," he greeted with a dry nod. "Harper," Charles replied, and Mary Elizabeth noticed how his posture became more rigid, more aggressive. "I was just proposing to Miss Sullivan a countryside outing. I'm sure someone with her education appreciates the finer arts of conversation." It was a subtle insult, but intentional. The implication was clear. James, with his rustic life and silences, couldn't offer the kind of company a lady like Mary Elizabeth deserved. Mary Elizabeth saw how James's jaw tensioned almost imperceptibly. He was a man who had learned to control his emotions, but she was beginning to read the signs others would miss. "Miss Sullivan is free to choose her own company," said James, but there was something in his voice that suggested the choice mattered to him more than he was willing to admit. "Of course," Charles smiled, but there was triumph in his eyes. "So, Mary Elizabeth, what do you say?" She found herself in an impossible position. Refusing Charles publicly would be a social rupture that would have consequences in such a small town. But accepting would mean something she wasn't sure she wanted it to mean. She looked at James, searching for some sign, some indication of what he wanted her to do. But his face was a mask of Western courtesy, as impenetrable as the mountains surrounding the valley. "It would be charming," she said finally, and saw how something extinguished in James's eyes. "Excellent." Charles took her hand again. "I'll come for you Sunday at 2. When Charles walked away, Mary Elizabeth and James were alone on the street. The silence that stretched between them was different from all they had shared before. This one hurt. "Mr. Harper, she began. "You need no explanations, Miss Sullivan," he interrupted, but his voice sounded rougher than usual. "As I said, you're free to choose your company." He turned to leave, but she stopped him by touching his arm. The muscle under his shirt tensioned at the contact. "Does it bother you?" James looked at her for a long moment, and Mary Elizabeth saw battles being fought in his grey eyes. Finally, he gently removed her hand from his arm. "It's not my business, miss." But the way he avoided her gaze while saying the words told her everything she needed to know. That afternoon, Mary Elizabeth sat on the boarding house porch mending a dress that didn't need repair, wondering why doing what society expected of her felt so much like betraying herself. In the distance, she could see James working on his ranch, and every fiber of her being wanted to walk there and tell him she had made a mistake. But her pride, educated in Charleston's complex social rules, prevented her. Why did the path toward respectability feel more and more like the path toward unhappiness? The storm arrived without warning, as important things in life usually do. Mary Elizabeth had taken refuge in the general store when the first drops began, to fall quickly, transforming into a curtain of water that turned Willow Creek streets into rivers of mud. Through the fogged window she watched, as the sky had become the color of molten lead. Lightning illuminated the distant prairies with ghostly light, and thunder echoed like war drums among the mountains. "Terrible weather," murmured Mr. Henderson, the store owner nervously organizing preserve jars. "I don't remember a storm like this since last summer." Mary Elizabeth nodded distractedly. Her mind wasn't on the weather, but on the events of recent days. The picnic with Charles had been exactly what she expected. He had talked incessantly about his plans to expand his father's bank, about his connections in Denver, about the bright future he could offer the right woman. All very appropriate. All very boring, all very empty. She had smiled at the right moments, made appropriate comments, played her role as a refined Southern lady to perfection. But every passing minute felt like she was betraying something essential within herself, especially when Charles had tried to kiss her by the river. It hadn't been violent but presumptuous. He had assumed that her acceptance of the picnic was an acceptance of his advances. When she gently pulled away, he had smiled as if she were simply shy, as if her resistance were part of the game ladies were supposed to play. "You just need time to get to know me better. Mary Elizabeth," he had said, with a confidence that had deeply irritated her. "I know we can be very happy together." The store door opened violently, letting in a gust of cold wind and rain. James Harper appeared in the doorway like an apparition emerged from the storm, soaked to the bone, his hat dripping water onto the wooden floor. "Miss Sullivan," he said, removing his hat, "I saw you here when the storm began. I came to make sure you were well." There was something in his voice that suggested he had fought with himself before deciding to come. Mary Elizabeth felt as if her heart leaped against her ribs. "Mr. Harper, you're soaked." "It's nothing." He approached the window, maintaining a carefully appropriate distance. "This storm will last a while. You'd better wait here until it clears." Mr. Henderson, sensing the tension in the air like an animal that feels an earthquake, mumbled something about checking inventory in the warehouse, and diplomatically disappeared. Mary Elizabeth and James were alone, with only the sound of rain beating on the zinc roof as background music. She watched him as he looked out the window, noticing how the water had plastered his shirt to his torso, how his damp hair curved slightly at his nape. "Did you enjoy your picnic?" he asked finally without looking at her. The question was casual, but Mary Elizabeth could feel the emotional weight behind it. It was pleasant. Charles is a good match. The word sounded like he was chewing glass. He can offer you many things. Like what? James turned to her, and in his eyes was a mixture of pain and resignation that frightened her. Stability, respectability, a life appropriate for a lady like you. And what do you know about what's appropriate for me? The question came out with more ferocity than she had intended. James recoiled, as if she had struck him. I know it's not me, he said simply. The silence that followed was thick as humidity before a storm. Mary Elizabeth felt she was standing on a precipice, and that the next words she spoke would determine the rest of her life. Mr. Harper, she began, but he interrupted her. James, if you're going to reject me, at least call me by name. Reject you? Her voice was barely a whisper. What are you talking about? James approached, and for the first time since she'd known him, he seemed vulnerable, as if all his defenses had been washed away by the rain. I'm talking about what has grown between us since the day you arrived. I'm talking about how my heart stops every time I see you. I'm talking about how I've lost sleep thinking about things I can't have. Mary Elizabeth felt as if the ground had become liquid beneath her feet. James, but I'm also talking about realities. His voice hardened. You're an educated lady from Charleston. I'm a solitary cowboy with more scars than money. Charles can give you a life in society. I can only offer you— What? She urged when he stopped. What can you offer me? Nothing the world would consider valuable. The brutal honesty in his voice hit her like a punch to the stomach, but it also freed her. In a world full of pretensions and falsehoods, here was a man who was completely real. Maybe the world is wrong about what's valuable, she said softly. James looked at her as if she were a miracle he didn't dare believe in. Mary Elizabeth, but there's a problem, she continued, and she saw him brace for the blow. The rumors. Mrs. McKinnon has made it very subtly known that some people in town are talking about the time we spend together, about how inappropriate it is for a single lady to be so much in the company of a single man. James closed his eyes as if feeling physical pain. I know, I've heard the whispers. That's why I thought perhaps Charles— Do you know what's ironic? Mary Elizabeth took a step closer. In Charleston, my reputation is already ruined. A 24-year-old spinster with no marriage prospects. That's why William sent me here to get me away from the gossip. And now I'm in another place with more gossip. She laughed, but there was no humor in the sound. Sometimes I think it doesn't matter what I do, there will always be someone to judge me. James took another step toward her. Now they were close enough for her to see the raindrops on his eyelashes. What if there were a way to silence the gossip? He asked slowly. What do you mean? What if we got married? Mary Elizabeth felt as if the world had stopped. Even the rain seemed to have paused its drumming against the roof. What? Listen to me before you say no. The words poured from him like a broken dam. A marriage? Temporary? Just on paper. Just until William returns and can take you back. To Charleston. You'd have the protection of a name, I'd have the respectability I apparently need, and the gossip would stop. A fake marriage. A business arrangement. His voice was rough. Without real obligations, separate rooms, separate lives, just a facade to satisfy the gossips. Mary Elizabeth looked into his eyes, searching for some sign of what he was really thinking. Was this what he really wanted, or was he sacrificing his own feelings for what he believed was best for her? And after, she asked. When William returns. After, you'll be free to leave, or to stay with Charles if that's what you want. I'll disappear from the picture. There was something devastatingly noble in his proposal, and also something completely painful. He was offering his protection and asking nothing in return except perhaps the torture of having her nearby without being able to really touch her. James, she said softly, what if I didn't want it to be just temporary? His eyes widened, and for a moment Mary Elizabeth saw hope bloom on his face like a flower after rain. But then, as if remembering who he was and who she was, the hope faded. Don't say things you can't really feel. This place, this situation, it's like a dream. But dreams end, Mary Elizabeth, and when you wake up, you'll remember who you really are. What if I've already awakened? She whispered. What if this isn't a dream but the first time I'm really alive? Thunder roared overhead, and Mary Elizabeth felt she was about to make the most important decision of her life. Could a fake marriage become something real, or was she about to condemn herself to love a man who believed he didn't deserve her? The church in Willow Creek had never seen anything like this. Built with pine wood and modest dreams, it had witnessed simple weddings between cowboys and teachers, between farmers and local girls whose parents had arrived in covered wagons. But it had never housed the marriage between a Charleston lady and the county's most silent cowboy, especially not one organized in 3 days. Mary Elizabeth found herself in the small back room of the church, contemplating her reflection in the cracked mirror that Reverend Porter had managed to borrow from Mrs. McKinnon. The dress she wore wasn't the elegant bridal gown she had dreamed of as a child, but a simple blue traveling dress she had brought from Charleston. But as she adjusted her lace gloves, she realized she had never felt more beautiful or more terrified. "You can still change your mind, dear," murmured Mrs. McKinnon while arranging the pleats of her skirt. The woman had been a whirlwind of activity since the engagement was announced, alternating between delight at the gossip and genuine concern for Mary Elizabeth. "Why would I change my mind?" "Well, it's all so sudden." Mrs. McKinnon lowered her voice conspiratorially. "And James Harper, though he's a good man, is so quiet. Are you sure you know him well enough?" Mary Elizabeth smiled. It was a fair question. What did she really know about James? She knew he was gentle with injured animals and patient with wild colts. She knew he tipped his hat when passing a lady and never spoke ill of anyone. She knew he had a worker's hands, but a poet's heart who had never learned to express himself with words. Was it enough to base a marriage on even a temporary one? "I know what I need to know," she said finally. From the other side of the door came the murmur of voices. The whole town had come, some out of curiosity, others out of genuine affection. Mary Elizabeth had been surprised to discover how much affection she had developed for these people in so short a time. "It's time," announced Reverend Porter, poking his head through the door. Mary Elizabeth took a deep breath, picked up the small bouquet of wildflowers she had gathered that morning, daisies and lavender that grew near James's ranch, and headed to the altar. The church was full. In the front row, Charles Whitmore sat with a tight smile that fooled no one. Mrs. McKinnon occupied the place of honor with a handkerchief ready for tears she knew would come. The town's cowboys had worn their best shirts, and the ladies wore their Sunday dresses. But Mary Elizabeth only had eyes for the man waiting in front of the altar. James had gotten a suit from somewhere. It was a bit big in the shoulders and a bit short in the sleeves, but he had combed his damp hair back and shaved so carefully she could see small cuts on his jaw where the razor had trembled. When their eyes met, Mary Elizabeth saw in them the same mixture of terror and determination she knew reflected her own. She walked toward him with measured steps, conscious that every person in that church was analyzing every expression on her face, every detail of her clothing, every nuance of her behavior. But as she approached James, the rest of the world began to dissolve until only the two of them existed. "You look beautiful," he murmured when she stood beside him. "You're nervous," she replied, noticing how his hands trembled slightly. "Terrified," he admitted with a crooked smile that made her fall a little more in love with him. Reverend Porter cleared his throat and began the ceremony. His words floated over them like an ancient blessing. "Dearly beloved, we are gathered here in the presence of God to unite this man and this woman in holy matrimony." Mary Elizabeth tried to concentrate on the words, but found herself lost in James's eyes. There was something hypnotic in the way he looked at her, as if he were memorizing every detail of her face. When the moment for vows came, Reverend Porter turned to James. "Do you take Mary Elizabeth Sullivan as your lawful wife, to love and cherish her in riches, and in poverty and sickness, and in health until death do you part?" James looked directly into her eyes when he answered, "I do." There was something in his voice that made the words sound like a real promise, not like part of an elaborate farce. "Do you take James Harper as your lawful husband, to love and cherish him in riches, and in poverty and sickness, "And in health until death do you part." Mary Elizabeth felt as if she were standing on the edge of a precipice. Part of her knew this. Was just theatre a social convenience? But another part, a part that grew with every passing moment, wished it were real. "I do," she said, and her voice sounded stronger and more confident than she felt. "The rings," requested the Reverend. James reached into his pocket and pulled out nothing. His face turned red as a sunset. He began, clearly mortified. Mary Elizabeth felt a wave of tenderness, so intense it almost knocked her down. Without thinking, she removed a small, gold ring that had belonged to her grandmother and handed it to him. "Use this," she whispered. The gratitude in James's eyes was like the sun rising after a storm. He took the ring with hands that no longer trembled and slipped it onto her finger, but not before kissing it softly. The gesture was so unexpected, so genuinely tender, that Mary Elizabeth felt tears stinging her eyes. "By the power vested in me, I pronounce you husband and wife," announced Reverend Porter. "You may kiss the bride." This was the moment both had feared and anticipated. They had agreed it would be just a formal kiss appropriate for the occasion, but when James leaned toward her when his lips met hers for the first time, nothing about the kiss was formal. It was soft at first, almost reverent. But then Mary Elizabeth felt how he surrendered to the moment, how his arms enveloped her, as if she were something precious that might disappear. She responded without thinking, losing all notion of place and occasion. When they finally separated, both were breathless. In James's eyes was a mixture of amazement and something that looked dangerously like true love. The church exploded in applause and cheers. Mrs. McKinnon sobbed happily into her handkerchief. The cowboys whistled and shouted congratulations. Even Charles Whitmore applauded, though his smile seemed carved in ice. But Mary Elizabeth barely noticed the commotion. She was still lost in the sensation of James's lips against hers, in the realization that what had begun as a practical arrangement was rapidly transforming into something much more complicated and dangerous. As they walked down the church aisle as husband and wife, James whispered in her ear, "What have we gotten ourselves into, Mary Elizabeth?" She squeezed his arm and smiled. "I don't know, but I suppose we'll find out together." Outside, the rain had stopped, and the sun was breaking through the clouds, painting the world with a gold that seemed to bless their unlikely union. But how to maintain the boundaries of a fake marriage when every moment together made those boundaries feel more like prisons than protections? James Harper's house was exactly what Mary Elizabeth had expected. Solid, functional, and marked by the solitude of a man who had lived too long without feminine company. The wooden beams smelled of pine and years of fireplace smoke. The windows were clean, but without curtains, and the few pieces of furniture were of good quality, but completely utilitarian. "It's not much," said James as he set down her luggage in the vestibule, carefully avoiding her gaze. "But it's solid, and it has 2 bedrooms." Mary Elizabeth walked through the main room, touching the back of a worn leather armchair, examining bookshelves that contained more books than she had expected. There were volumes of poetry next to cattle manuals, Dickens novels beside treatises on horse care. "You read a lot," she observed. "The nights are long here." He removed his hat and hung it on a hook by the door. "Especially in winter." There was something melancholy in his voice that made Mary Elizabeth wonder how many nights he had spent alone in this house reading by oil lamplight while the wind howled through the mountains. "Which is my room?" she asked, trying to maintain a practical tone. James pointed to a door at the end of a short hallway. "It was my parents' room. It has the best view of the valley. I'll stay in the front room." "Your parents?" "They died 5 years ago. Fever." The words came out dry, as if he had practiced saying them without emotion. "They left the house and the ranch." Mary Elizabeth felt a pang of understanding. Now she understood the loneliness she saw in his eyes, the careful way he maintained emotional distance. He had learned that loving meant losing. "I'm sorry," she said softly. It was a long time ago. But the way he avoided her gaze told her that time hadn't completely healed those wounds. That first night they dined in a silence charged with tension. James had prepared a simple but flavorful stew, and Mary Elizabeth had contributed bread she had learned to make with Mrs. McKinnon. It was domestic and strange at the same time, as if they were playing the roles of husband and wife, without really knowing how to do it. "Tomorrow we can go to town," said James as they cleared the dishes. "So you can buy whatever you need to feel comfortable here." "How long do you think William will take to return?" "According to his last telegram, at least a month. Maybe 2 months. 2 months living under the same roof, playing the role of spouses, while fighting against feelings that grew stronger each day." "James," she began, but he had already risen from the table. "It's late. You should rest. Tomorrow you can explore the property, get to know the place." It was a clear excuse to avoid any conversation that might become too personal. Mary Elizabeth nodded, understanding that he needed time to adjust as much as she did. That night, lying in the bed that had belonged to James's parents, Mary Elizabeth listened to the sounds of the house, the creaking of beams settling the wind through the cottonwoods near the house, and somewhere down the hall, James's restless footsteps. Was he as disturbed by her presence as she was by his? The next morning dawned clear and bright. Mary Elizabeth got up early, dressed in one of her most practical dresses, and went out to explore. She found James in the stable brushing his favorite horse, a chestnut named Thunder. "Good morning," she said, staying at the stable entrance. "Good morning." His voice sounded hoarse, as if he had slept little. "Did you sleep well?" "Very well, thank you." It was a polite lie. Both knew it. "Would you like to see the rest of the ranch?" he asked, clearly seeking an activity that would keep their minds occupied with practical things. For the next hour, James showed her the property with the reserved pride of a man who had worked hard for what he had. The corrals were well maintained, the stables were clean and organized, and there was a small garden that had clearly been neglected but had potential. "Who took care of this before?" asked Mary Elizabeth, touching the tomato plants that desperately needed attention. "My mother. After she died, I don't have a way with plants." There was sadness in his voice, but also something that sounded like an opportunity. "Would you mind if I fixed it up?" James looked at her with surprise. "Do you know about gardening?" "My grandmother had a beautiful garden in Charleston. I spent many afternoons helping her." Mary Elizabeth knelt and began pulling weeds without waiting for his answer. "Plants just need a little care and patience." "Like people," murmured James, and when she looked up he was watching her with an intensity that made her blush. That afternoon, while Mary Elizabeth worked in the garden, James repaired a section of fence nearby. It was a comfortable arrangement that allowed them to be close without having to talk constantly, but Mary Elizabeth was deeply conscious of his presence. From time to time he stopped his work to watch her, and she felt the weight of his gaze like a caress. When the sun began to decline, both were sweaty and tired, but there was a satisfaction in the air that hadn't been there in the morning. "Are you hungry?" asked James. "I can prepare something." "Let me cook," offered Mary Elizabeth. "It's the least I can do." James seemed about to protest, but then nodded. "The ingredients are in the pantry, and Mary Elizabeth—" He stopped when she headed toward the house. "Yes, thank you for the garden. My mother would have liked to see it blooming again." It was the first time he had mentioned his mother without it seeming to hurt. Mary Elizabeth smiled. "I like taking care of things that grow." That night conversation during dinner flowed more easily. James told her about the ranch's early days, about how his father had chosen this land for its access to water and the protection offered by the surrounding hills. Mary Elizabeth shared memories of Charleston, but found herself talking more about her grandmother and the garden than about the balls and social gatherings that had dominated her previous life. When it came time to retire, both lingered in the living room as if neither wanted to break the connection they had established. "Good night, Mary Elizabeth," said James finally. "Good night, James." But when he leaned over to touch her hand in a farewell gesture, both stood still. The contact, which had been intended to be purely formal, became charged with electricity. James slowly raised his hand to her cheek, brushing it with the tenderness she had seen him touch injured animals. "This is becoming harder than I thought," he admitted. "What pretending this is just a business arrangement." Mary Elizabeth covered his hand with hers. "Who said we're pretending?" They looked at each other in the charged silence of the room, both conscious they were at a point of no return. The rules they had established for their temporary marriage were crumbling under the weight of feelings neither had anticipated. But what would happen when the reality of the outside world burst into their little domestic paradise? The Willow Creek Community Almanac arrived on Monday morning with the regularity of the seasons. Mrs. McKinnon had created it as a way to keep the community together, a shared meal on the last Sunday of each month, where each family contributed a dish and everyone gathered in the meadow behind the church to talk gossip and strengthen the bonds that kept the small town functioning. For Mary Elizabeth, it would be her first public appearance as James's wife since the incident with Charles the previous Sunday. She had spent the week walking on eggshells, feeling how the tension between her and James grew like a storm on the horizon. He had been scrupulously polite but distant, more distant than ever, as if Charles's words had reminded him of the barriers he had tried to build around his heart. "Are you sure we should go?" asked Mary Elizabeth as she packed the apple pie she had baked that morning. Her hands trembled slightly as she arranged the cloth over the pan. "People will expect to see us," replied James from the doorway where he waited with his hat in hand. "It would be strange if we didn't attend." It would be strange, as if they were actors who had to maintain their role in a play neither wanted to continue performing. The meadow behind the church buzzed with activity when they arrived. Long tables made of planks and sawhorses stretched under the cottonwoods, covered with homemade tablecloths, and an abundance of food that spoke of the community's generosity. Children ran between the tables, their laughter mixing with the murmur of adult conversations and the occasional whinny of horses tied nearby. James, Mary Elizabeth, Mrs. McKinnon approached like a whirlwind of skirts and enthusiasm. "How wonderful to see you. Mary Elizabeth, that pie smells divine. You must give me the recipe." Mary Elizabeth smiled and murmured appropriate courtesies, but her eyes involuntarily sought Charles Whitmore. She found him near the drinks table, watching her with a smile that promised trouble. The meal progressed with usual normalcy. Mary Elizabeth found herself in conversation with the other town ladies, talking about recipes, about the weather, about the small domestic dramas that kept Willow Creek's world spinning. But she was conscious of James's every movement, of how he stayed close, but never touched her, of how he responded to jokes about newlywed life, with smiles that didn't reach his eyes. It was after dessert when Charles made his move. "My friends," he said, rising from his place and gently tapping his glass with a spoon to call attention. "If you'll permit me, I'd like to propose a toast." An expectant silence fell over the gathering. Mary Elizabeth felt as if the air had become thick, difficult to breathe. "To our dear newlyweds, James and Mary Elizabeth Harper." Charles raised his glass, but there was something in his smile that made Mary Elizabeth's stomach churn. "For a marriage that has been a true revelation for all of us." There was something in his tone that made some heads turn, some conversations stop. Mary Elizabeth saw James tense like a bow about to shoot. Charles warned James, but Charles continued, as if he hadn't heard him. "It's fascinating, don't you think?" Charles addressed the crowd. "How two people can marry so suddenly, especially when there's so little visible romance between them." The silence thickened. Mary Elizabeth could feel the eyes of the entire town fixed on her curiosity, slowly transforming into suspicion. "In fact," continued Charles, clearly enjoying his moment, "I wonder if all of you know the true nature of this. So it's a practical marriage. That's enough." James stood abruptly, his chair scraping against the ground. "Enough," Charles laughed. "But I'm barely getting started. Don't you think the good people of Willow Creek deserve to know they've been celebrating a farce?" Mary Elizabeth's world crumbled. "You see," Charles continued, his voice carrying clearly to every corner of the silent meadow, "I had the fortune to overhear a very interesting conversation a few weeks ago. A conversation in which our dear newlyweds discussed the terms of their temporary marriage, a marriage designed purely to silence gossip, with no intention of consummation or permanence. The murmurs began like distant thunder and spread like fire in dry grass. Mary Elizabeth saw horror on Mrs. McKinnon's face, surprise on Reverend Porter's, and a mixture of judgment and pity on the other women's faces. In other words, Charles smiled triumphantly, Miss Sullivan here never intended to be a real wife. She's just playing a role until she can return to her real life in Charleston. James moved then, crossing the space between him and Charles in 3 long strides. For a moment, Mary Elizabeth thought he was going to hit the other man, and from the way Charles recoiled, he thought so too. But James was a controlled man, even in his fury. "Whitmore," he said, and his voice was low but carried a threat that made several men rise from their seats. "I think it's time for you to leave." "Why?" Charles regained his composure, smiling. "For telling the truth, these good people deserve to know they've been deceived." Mary Elizabeth found herself standing, her legs trembling, but her voice steady. "Mr. Whitmore," she said, and there was something in her tone that made the entire crowd turn to her. "You're right about one thing, these people deserve the truth." She saw panic cross James's face, but Mary Elizabeth had already decided. She couldn't continue living a lie, especially not when that lie was hurting people she had come to love. "When James and I married," she continued, her voice carrying clearly in the silent air, "we did so for practical reasons, to protect my reputation and silence malicious gossip." The murmurs intensified, but Mary Elizabeth raised a hand and, surprisingly, the crowd fell silent. "But what Mr. Whitmore doesn't understand, what he can't understand, is that the reasons we begin something don't determine what it becomes." She turned to James, and in his eyes, she saw a mixture of terror and hope that tore at her heart. "Yes, our marriage began as a business arrangement, but in the weeks we've lived together, I've come to know a man of honor, of kindness, of quiet strength, who has taught me what true love means." James looked at her as if she were a miracle he didn't dare believe in. "So yes, Mr. Whitmore, my marriage began as a convenience, but what it is now is real. And if that offends you, or anyone in this town, then perhaps William was right to send me away from Charleston. Perhaps I don't belong in places where appearance matters more than the truth of the heart." She turned to the crowd, her head held high, despite the tears threatening to fall. "I am Mary Elizabeth Harper. I am James Harper's wife. And if any of you have a problem with that, you're welcome to express it now." The silence that followed was complete. Even the children had stopped playing, sensing the tension in the air. It was Mrs. McKinnon who spoke first. "Well," she said, rising from her place with determination, "I suppose that clears things up. And I must say, dear, that any woman who has the courage to defend her husband and her marriage like that deserves respect, no matter how that marriage began." One by one, the other community members began to nod, to murmur agreement. Charles found himself alone in his bitter triumph, surrounded by people who had decided that Mary Elizabeth's honesty was more valuable than his malicious revelations. "This isn't over," muttered Charles as he walked away, but his words were lost in the rumble of conversations resuming. James approached Mary Elizabeth, and when she looked at him, she saw something in his eyes that had never been there before, unlimited admiration. "Mary Elizabeth," he began, but she stopped him with a hand on his arm. "Let's go home, James, please." He nodded, and together they headed to their wagon, conscious that everything had changed irrevocably. But had it changed for better or worse? And now that the truth was exposed, could they build something real on the foundations of what had begun as a lie? The journey back to the ranch unfolded in a silence that vibrated with everything they hadn't said. Mary Elizabeth kept her hands clasped in her lap, conscious of James's every movement as he drove the wagon, of the tension in his shoulders, of the careful way he avoided looking at her. She had made the riskiest decision of her life in front of the entire town, had laid her heart bare for him to see. And now, in the silence that followed her public declaration, she was beginning to wonder if she had misread the signs, if she had confused kindness with love, convenience with destiny. When they reached the house, James helped her down from the wagon with the automatic courtesy he had perfected, but his fingers barely brushed hers before pulling away. "Mary Elizabeth," he began as she headed toward the house. "Please," she said, without turning around, "don't say anything yet, I need a moment." She took refuge in her room, closing the door softly behind her, before allowing the tears she had been holding back to finally fall. She had exposed herself completely, had defended their marriage in front of the entire town, had declared her love. And James hadn't said a word. What had she expected? That he would take her in his arms right there in front of the entire community, that he would declare that he too had changed, that the business arrangement had blossomed into something real. Maybe she was living in a fantasy. Maybe he still saw this as something temporary, something that would end when William returned. She changed clothes, washed her face, and tried to regain her composure. Outside, she could hear James moving through the house, the creak of his footsteps on the wooden floor, the sound of drawers opening and closing. When she finally emerged from her room, she found him in the kitchen, standing before the window that overlooked the garden she had been tending. There was something in his posture that spoke of an internal battle of decisions being made and discarded. "James," she said softly. He turned, and Mary Elizabeth saw something on his face she had never seen before: complete vulnerability. As if all the defenses he had carefully built had been dismantled. "Was it true," he asked, and his voice sounded hoarse, "what you said there? Was it true? Which part? The part about loving me?" Mary Elizabeth felt as if she was standing on the edge of a precipice. One wrong word and everything would crumble. One right word, and perhaps, just perhaps, they could build something beautiful on the ruins of their original agreement. "Every word," she said simply. James closed his eyes as if he had received a physical blow. "Mary Elizabeth, you don't need to say anything," she hurried to say. "I know this wasn't part of our agreement. I know this was supposed to be temporary, without emotional complications. And if you want me to keep my feelings to myself, I'll do it. But I couldn't continue pretending, especially not after what Charles did." "Keep them to yourself." James opened his eyes, and there was something fierce in them that surprised her. "Do you think I want you to keep to yourself the first truly beautiful thing that's entered my life in years?" Mary Elizabeth felt as if the world had stopped. What James approached, and for the first time since they'd known each other, there was no careful distance in his approach. He stopped close enough for her to see the small lines around his eyes, the almost invisible scars on his worker's hands. "Do you think I've been living under the same roof as you, watching how you bring life to my house, to my land, to my empty existence, without falling in love a little more each day?" His voice broke slightly on the last words. "Do you think I've been pretending the way my heart races every time you smile at me? The way every night I fight the impulse to go to your room, not to touch you, but just to make sure you're still here, that you're not a dream that will disappear?" Mary Elizabeth felt tears running down her cheeks, but these were different from the tears of frustration she had shed before. These were tears of relief, of joy, of a love finally recognized. "Then why," she began, "why did I keep my distance?" James raised a trembling hand to her cheek, gently wiping away a tear. "Because I was afraid. Because I had never felt anything like this and didn't know how to handle it. Because every day that passed I loved you more, and every day that passed I realized more that when William returned, I would have to make a decision." "What decision?" "The decision to stay with a cowboy who has nothing to offer you except a simple life, in a place where winter is long and society is non-existent, or return to Charleston where you belong, where you can have the life you were educated for." Mary Elizabeth looked at him with incredulity. "Do you think I belong in Charleston?" "Don't you?" "James Harper," she said, and there was a note of exasperation in her voice. "I'm a 24-year-old woman who never married because I couldn't find a man in all of Charleston's salons who made me feel half of what you make me feel just by looking at me. I'm a woman who was sent here because I was a social embarrassment, because I didn't fit the mold I was supposed to fill." She moved closer, putting her hands on his chest, feeling the rapid beat of his heart under her palms. "Do you know when?" "The first moment was that I felt really alive. The first moment I felt I was where I was supposed to be. When? The day I arrived here. The day I met you. The day that for the first time in my life, a man looked at me and saw something more than a decorative piece for his arm, or an advantageous social connection." James looked at her as if she were a miracle. "Mary Elizabeth, I love you, James. I don't love the idea of you. I don't love what you might represent. I love you, your silence, your kindness, the way you treat injured animals as if they were sacred. I love how you read in the evenings. I love the sound of your laughter when you finally let it out. I love this house, this ranch, this life we've been building together. His hands found her face, framing it, as if it were something precious. What if William wants you to return? William can want many things. But I'm an adult woman, and this is my choice. And I choose this, I choose you, I choose this life if you want me in it. James looked at her for a long moment, and Mary Elizabeth saw the exact moment when he decided to believe in the miracle he was being offered. If I want you, he murmured. Mary Elizabeth, you're the only thing I've wanted since the day you stepped down from that stagecoach. When he finally kissed her, it wasn't like the ceremonial kiss of their wedding. This kiss spoke of real promises, of recognized love, of a future stretching before them like the golden valley that surrounded their home. When they separated, both were breathless. James rested his forehead against hers. Are you sure, he whispered, because once you cross this line with me, once this becomes real, I won't be able to let you go. Mary Elizabeth smiled, feeling as if she had finally come home. James Harper. I've never been more sure of anything in my life. Outside, the sun was setting over Montana, painting the sky in shades of gold and pink. And inside the house that was now truly their home, Mary Elizabeth Harper fell in love with her husband for the second time in the same day. But would their love be enough to survive the trials that were still to come? October came to Willow Creek like a symphony of golden colors. The cottonwoods that lined the ranch had transformed into yellow torches that trembled with every breeze, and the morning air carried the crisp aroma of dry leaves and the distant promise of winter. Mary Elizabeth found herself in the kitchen preparing preserves from the last apples from the garden she had rescued during the summer. Her hands moved with an efficiency that would have surprised the Charleston lady who had arrived 2 months earlier. Physical work, the rhythm of the seasons, the satisfaction of creating something useful with her own hands, all of this had awakened in her a part she never knew existed. James entered through the back door, bringing with him the aroma of hay and leather that she now associated with safety and home. His eyes found hers immediately, as they always did, and the smile that spread across his face was like the sun rising after a storm. "Smells delicious," he said, approaching to see her work. "The last harvest," replied Mary Elizabeth, feeling the familiar warmth that always invaded her when he was near. "Mrs. McKinnon says, if we preserve these apples well, we'll have pies until February." James positioned himself behind her, his arms enveloping her waist as she worked. It was a gesture that had begun timidly weeks ago and was now as natural as breathing. "Mrs. McKinnon," he murmured against her ear. "When did she start giving advice about preserves?" "Yesterday, when I went to town." Mary Elizabeth leaned back against his chest. She also said that Charles finally left for Denver. Apparently his father decided he needed perspective after the incident. James tensed slightly. The scandal at the community almanac had had lasting consequences. While most of the town had rallied in support of Mary Elizabeth, after her brave declaration, Charles had found his social position severely compromised. "Better for everyone," murmured James. Mary Elizabeth turned in his arms, studying his face. "Is there something else worrying you?" It was one of the things she loved most about their new intimacy, the way she had learned to read his moods, how he had begun to trust her with his concerns. "A letter arrived," he said finally. Mary Elizabeth felt her stomach contract. "From William. Yes, it's on the table." With hands she tried to keep steady, Mary Elizabeth picked up the letter and broke the seal. William's familiar handwriting leaped from the page. "Dear Mary Elizabeth, I hope this letter finds you well. Affairs here in Denver have become more complicated than I anticipated, but they are finally reaching a resolution. I plan to return to Willow Creek next week to escort you back to Charleston. I have made arrangements for you to stay with Aunt Margaret until we can organize an appropriate marriage. Mr. Charles Whitmore has expressed continued interest, and I believe we can reach an advantageous agreement. Please prepare your luggage. We will depart as soon as I arrive. Your devoted brother, William." Mary Elizabeth dropped the letter as if it had burned her. James picked it up, read it silently, and when he finished, his face was a mask of carefully controlled pain. "So Charles has been writing letters," he said, and there was a coldness in his voice that Mary Elizabeth hadn't heard before. "James, no," he raised a hand. "I understand your brother has plans for you, good plans, respectable ones, the kind of life you deserve." Mary Elizabeth looked at him with incredulity. "After everything we've shared, after what we've said to each other, do you think I'm going to pack my bags and leave as if none of this mattered? What other choice do you have? He's your brother, your family. You're my family now." James looked at her as if she were something beautiful but unattainable. "Mary Elizabeth, be realistic. William will never accept this. He'll never accept me. And if you have to choose between him and me—" "There's no choice to make," she interrupted. "I've already chosen. I chose you, I chose this life, I chose this place, and nothing William says will change that. What if he cuts you off completely? What if you never see your family again?" The question hit her like a punch. She hadn't considered that possibility, or perhaps she had refused to consider it. Then it will be his loss," she said, but her voice sounded less sure than she would have liked. James studied her, seeing the doubt she was trying to hide. "I can't ask you to do that. I can't ask you to sacrifice your family for me, and I can't ask you to trust that I know what I want." They looked at each other in the charged silence of the kitchen, both conscious that a storm was approaching that could destroy everything they had built. "What are we going to do?" asked Mary Elizabeth finally. James approached, taking her hands in his. "We're going to face this together, as spouses. Real ones this time, without conditions, without temporary agreements." "What do you mean?" "I mean that when William arrives, he's going to find that his sister is truly married. In every sense that matters." Mary Elizabeth's heart accelerated. "James, if this is going to be real, if we're going to fight for it, then it needs to be completely real." His voice became soft but intense. "I love you, Mary Elizabeth. I love you like I never thought it would be possible to love someone. And if William wants to separate us, he's going to have to face not just a cowboy who's putting on an act, but a husband who's fighting for his wife." Mary Elizabeth felt tears in her eyes, but these were tears of relief and joy. "Are you sure? I've never been more sure of anything." They kissed then, and it was a kiss that sealed promises and erased the last vestiges of their original agreement. They were no longer two people playing roles, they were husband and wife, united not just by legal documents, but by love, choice, and determination. That night, for the first time since their marriage, Mary Elizabeth didn't sleep alone. She fell asleep. When James's arms, feeling the steady beat of his heart under her cheek, listening to the October wind whisper through the cottonwoods like a blessing. When she woke at dawn, she found James already awake, watching her with a tenderness that left her breathless. "Good morning, wife," he murmured, and there was something in the way he said the word that made her feel as if she had just been born. "Good morning, husband." They stayed like that in the golden morning light, storing moments of perfection against the storm they knew was approaching, because in 3 days, William Sullivan would arrive in Willow Creek. And when he did, he would discover that his sister was no longer the obedient lady he had sent to Montana. She was Mary Elizabeth Harper. And for the first time in her life, she knew exactly who she was and what was worth fighting for. But would her new strength be enough to resist the family and social pressures that threatened to separate her from the love she had found? William Sullivan arrived in Willow Creek on a Tuesday morning, with the dust from the road still settling around the stagecoach, when he descended with the authority of a man accustomed to having his orders followed without question. Mary Elizabeth watched him from the living room window, feeling a strange mixture of joy at seeing her brother after so long and apprehension about the conversation she knew would come. "He looks exactly the same," she murmured, studying the familiar figure, tall, well-dressed, with the erect bearing he had inherited from their father, along with the blue eyes and brown hair they shared. James positioned himself behind her, his hand finding her shoulder in a gesture of silent support. "Are you ready for this?" Mary Elizabeth turned to him, memorizing his face, the strong line of his jaw, the grey eyes that had learned to read her so well, the mouth she now knew intimately. "Ready?" She had spent 3 days preparing for this moment, 3 days during which she and James had talked about strategies, about arguments, about all the possible ways to make William understand that their marriage wasn't the farce it had begun. But more importantly, she had spent 3 days simply being happy, storing memories of their life together like treasure against uncertain times. The door opened without anyone knocking, a liberty William had always taken in spaces he considered his by right. "Mary Elizabeth," he said, and his voice carried the tone of affectionate authority he had used with her since they were children. "I hope you've packed your bags. The stagecoach leaves in 2 hours." He stopped abruptly when he saw James. His eyes moved between them, noting the proximity, the way James's hand rested possessively on her shoulder, the air of intimacy that surrounded them. "William," said Mary Elizabeth, keeping her voice calm, "you look well. The trip must have been successful." "Very successful." But his eyes didn't stop studying James. "Mr. Harper, I presume?" "Mr. Sullivan." James extended his hand. "It's a pleasure to finally meet you." William shook the offered hand, but Mary Elizabeth could see the evaluation he was making. The calloused worker's hands, the simple clothes, the relaxed posture, that contrasted sharply with the formal rigidity he considered appropriate. "So you're the man who has been caring for my sister," said William, and there was a deliberate pause that turned caring for into something slightly disdainful. "William." Mary Elizabeth stepped forward, feeling the tension thickening like humidity before a storm. "James is my husband." "Yes, I received the telegram about your temporary marriage." William removed his gloves with precise movements. "A clever solution to a delicate social problem. I hope it served its purpose." Mary Elizabeth felt as if she had been slapped. The casual way William dismissed their marriage, as if it was simply a business agreement that had completed its function. "It wasn't temporary," said James, and there was something in his voice that made William turn to him with renewed attention. "It's our marriage, real in every sense." William laughed, but it was a sound without humor. "Mr. Harper, I appreciate that you've taken care of Mary Elizabeth during my absence, but surely you understand that this arrangement was never intended to be permanent." "Arrangement?" Mary Elizabeth felt her southern temper awakening, the same fire she had seen in her grandmother when someone dared question her dignity. "William, this isn't an arrangement. It's my marriage. It's my life. It's my choice." "Your choice?" William turned to her, and for the first time since he had entered, he really looked at her. Mary Elizabeth saw the moment when he noticed the changes, the healthy color in her cheeks, the strength in her posture, the way her hands, which had once been soft as petals, now showed the marks of honest work. "Mary Elizabeth, look at what this place has done to you." "What has it done to me?" "You've hardened." There was genuine sadness in his voice. "The sister I left here was a lady, elegant, refined, appropriate. And now what now? I'm happy. Now I know who I really am. Now you look like a farmer's wife." The words hung in the air like a sentence. Mary Elizabeth saw pain cross James's face, saw how he stepped back as if he had been physically struck. "William Sullivan," said Mary Elizabeth, and her voice was soft but loaded with an authority she had never used with her brother before. "Take those words back right now. Take them back, Mary Elizabeth. I'm trying to save you from a mistake you'll regret for the rest of your life. This man, this place, they're not for you. You belong in Charleston, in society, in a life that means something. My life here means something. What taking care of cattle making preserves living in isolation." Mary Elizabeth looked at her brother, seeing for the first time the limitations of his understanding, the barriers he had built around his definition of value and meaning. "William, sit down," she said softly. "Please." Something in her tone must have touched him, because he obeyed, choosing the leather armchair that had belonged to James's father. Mary Elizabeth sat in front of him, with James standing behind her, like a solid and comforting presence. "Do you remember," she began, "when we were children and you used to ask me what I wanted to be when I grew up? Of course, you wanted to be a mother, a wife, the appropriate aspirations for a lady." "No, William, those were the answers I knew you wanted to hear. What I really wanted was to feel useful. I wanted to feel that my life had purpose beyond being decorative." William frowned, clearly confused. In Charleston I was a burden, continued Mary Elizabeth. A 24-year-old spinster, with no appropriate marriage prospects. A social problem that needed to be solved. You sent me here to get me away from gossip, remember? To protect you, to hide me. There was no accusation in her voice, only sadness. And maybe you were right to do it. Because here in this place, you consider inferior, I found something I never had in all of Charleston's elegant salons. What? I found someone who loves me for who I really am, not for the social connections I can offer. I found work that satisfies me, land I can help flourish. I found a community that accepts me, imperfections and all. And I found a version of myself I didn't know existed. She stood walking to the window that overlooked the garden she had rescued from abandonment. Do you see that garden? It was dead when I arrived here. But with care, with patience, with love, it came back to life. That's what this place did to me, William. It brought me back to life. William followed her to the window, and when he looked at the flourishing garden, something changed in his expression. It's beautiful, he admitted. Like my marriage, like my life here. William turned to James, studying him with new attention. Do you really love her? More than my own life, replied James without hesitation. And can you support her? Can you give her the security she deserves? I can give her a home. I can give her fidelity. I can give her a life full of purpose and meaning. And I can give her unconditional love for the rest of my days. William was silent for a long moment, processing everything he had heard and seen. Charles Whitmore wrote to me, he said finally. He told me the marriage was a farce, that you were living as strangers. Charles Whitmore is a spiteful liar, said Mary Elizabeth firmly, and a coward who left town when his poison wasn't received as he expected. But it did begin as a temporary arrangement, didn't it? Mary Elizabeth exchanged a look with James. Yes, she admitted. It began as a convenience. But William, some of history's strongest marriages began as practical alliances. What matters isn't how something began, but what it becomes. William sat heavily in a chair, and for the first time since he had arrived, he looked like the older brother who genuinely worried about her, instead of the patriarch who expected obedience. Aunt Margaret has already made plans, he said softly. There's a suitor, a widower with good connections. It would be an advantageous marriage. For whom? Asked Mary Elizabeth. For me or for the Sullivan family's prestige? William looked up at her, and Mary Elizabeth saw the moment when he really heard her, perhaps for the first time in their lives. I just want you to be happy, Mary Elizabeth. Then let me stay. Let me live the life I've chosen with the man I've chosen. The silence stretched between them, charged with years of family expectations, social traditions, love, complicated by obligations. Finally, William stood and walked to James. If you ever hurt her, if you can't keep the promises you've made to her, I'll come for her. Do you understand? I understand, replied James, and I hope you do. William nodded, then turned to Mary. Elizabeth, I suppose I have to cancel some arrangements in Charleston. Mary Elizabeth felt as if she could fly. She ran to her brother and hugged him, feeling how he gradually relaxed in her arms. Thank you, William. Thank you for trusting my judgment. I hope I'm not making a mistake, he murmured against her hair. You're not. I promise you're not. That night during dinner, William shared stories from Denver from the business deals he had been negotiating. Mary Elizabeth and James shared stories of their life on the ranch of the community that had welcomed them, of the plans they had for the future. And slowly, as the evening progressed, Mary Elizabeth saw her brother begin to understand that she hadn't lost her refinement. She had transformed it into something more authentic. But would William's reluctant approval be enough to secure their future, or were there more storms waiting on the horizon? The letter arrived 3 days after William had given his reluctant blessing to the marriage. Mary Elizabeth found it slipped under the front door when she came down to prepare breakfast, and something about the elegant paper, the feminine and careful handwriting, made her stomach contract with foreboding. James was in the stable tending to a mare about to foal. William had gone to town to make arrangements for his return trip to Charleston. The house was quiet, filled with the golden October light that filtered through the newly cleaned windows. Mary Elizabeth broke the seal with slightly trembling fingers. Dear Mrs. Harper, I hope you won't consider me impertinent for writing to you, but circumstances compel me to communicate with you. My name is Catherine Morrison, and I was very close to your husband some years ago. I recently learned of your marriage, and while I wish to congratulate you, I feel there are things about James's past that you should know. Things he perhaps hasn't shared with you. I will be in Billings until the end of this week, staying at the Victoria Hotel. If it's possible for you, I would like to speak with you personally. There are aspects of James's character that as a woman I believe you have the right to know before. It's too late. With my most sincere concern for your well-being, Catherine Morrison. Mary Elizabeth read the letter 3 times, feeling how each word etched itself into her mind like fire on wood. Who was Catherine Morrison? What secrets from James's past could be so important that a stranger felt compelled to reveal them? More importantly, why had James never mentioned a woman who had clearly been significant in his life during the past? Weeks she had believed she knew her husband intimately. They had shared stories of their childhood dreams, for the future fears and hopes they had never revealed to anyone else. But now, reading this letter, she realized there were gaps in James's. Past periods of his life he spoke of in vague terms, or simply avoided completely. She heard his footsteps on the back porch, and quickly folded the letter, placing it in her apron pocket. She wasn't ready to confront him, not until she knew more. "Good morning, wife," said James, entering with the aroma of hay and leather she had come to associate with safety and home. "Good morning." Her voice sounded normal, but she could feel the letter burning against her side like evidence of unrevealed secrets. "How is the mare? We're better. I think the foal will be born in the next few days." He approached to kiss her, but Mary Elizabeth subtly moved away under the pretense of serving coffee. James stopped studying her with those grey eyes that had learned to read her so well. "Is something wrong?" "Nothing. Just tired." It was a lie, and both knew it. But James was a man who respected boundaries, who understood that sometimes people needed space to process their thoughts. "Where's William?" "In town, making arrangements for the trip." They had breakfast in a silence charged with tension. James had prepared a simple but flavorful stew, and Mary Elizabeth had contributed bread she had learned to make with Mrs. McKinnon. It was domestic and strange at the same time, as if they were playing the roles of husband and wife without really knowing how to do it. After James left to work in the corrals, Mary Elizabeth found herself walking through the house like a restless ghost. Her eyes rested on familiar objects, James's books, his favorite armchair photographs of his parents on the mantelpiece. But now everything seemed charged with mystery. How much of what she believed she knew about him was real? By mid-morning, she made a decision that surprised her. She saddled James's gentlest mare, a chestnut named Honey, and headed to town. She would tell William she had urgent shopping to do, take the stagecoach to Billings, and meet with Catherine Morrison. She needed to know the truth, no matter how painful it might be. The trip to Billings took most of the day. Mary Elizabeth had travelled by stagecoach many times in Charleston, but never alone, never on a mission so loaded with anxiety. Each mile that passed took her further from the safety of her new home and closer to truths she might not want to know. The Victoria Hotel was elegant by Montana standards, though it would have been considered modest in Charleston. Mary Elizabeth announced herself at the reception and waited in the lobby, fighting the impulse to flee back to Willow Creek. Catherine Morrison turned out to be a beautiful woman of about 30, with golden blonde hair and blue eyes that spoke of intelligence and determination. Her dress was elegant but not ostentatious, and she moved with the grace of someone accustomed to refined society. "Mrs. Harper," she said, extending a gloved hand, "how brave of you to come. I wasn't sure you would." "Mrs. Morrison." Mary Elizabeth studied the other woman's face, searching for clues about her relationship with James. "Your letter was intriguing. Please, let's sit. What I have to tell you is complicated." They settled into leather armchairs near a window overlooking Billings Main Street. Catherine ordered tea, and for a few minutes they lost themselves in the social courtesies both had perfected in their respective educations. Finally, Catherine put her cup on the table and looked directly at Mary Elizabeth. "I met James 5 years ago in Denver. I was in a difficult situation, My husband had died, leaving me with considerable debts, and I found myself without means to support myself. Mary Elizabeth nodded, not knowing where the story was going. James was in Denver, buying cattle. He was different then, more open, more willing to trust. We met at a social gathering, and he took an interest in my situation. How he helped me, financially. He gave me enough money to pay my debts and establish myself as a seamstress, without conditions, without expectations, simply because it was the right thing to do. Mary Elizabeth felt a mixture of pride and confusion. The story spoke well of James's character, but didn't explain the ominous tone of the letter. "That sounds like something he would do," she said. "Yes, but that's not the whole story." Catherine lowered her voice. "I fell in love with him, Mrs. Harper, deeply, and for a time I believed my feelings were reciprocated." Mary Elizabeth's heart began to beat faster. "We spent several months together. He came to Denver regularly on business, and I waited for those visits like a woman waits for dawn. I believed we were heading toward marriage. And what happened? One night after we had been here together, I asked him about the future, about his intentions toward me." Catherine paused, and Mary Elizabeth saw real pain in her eyes. "And what did he say?" "He told me he couldn't marry me, that there was something in his past, something he had done that made it impossible for him to love permanently. He said that any woman who attached herself to him would eventually regret it." "Did he tell you what it was?" "No. But that night, after he left, I found something among his things, a newspaper clipping that had fallen out." Catherine opened her purse and pulled out a yellowed piece of paper. With trembling hands, she handed it to Mary Elizabeth. It was an article from a Denver newspaper dated 6 years ago. The headline read, "Tragedy at local mine results in 3 deaths." Mary Elizabeth read quickly, her heart sinking with each word. The article described a collapse in a mine near Denver. 3 men had died when a poorly supported tunnel had caved in. The investigation had found that the engineer in charge had made changes to the original safety plans to speed up the operation. The engineer's name was James Harper. Mary Elizabeth felt as if the world had stopped. The paper trembled in her hands as she read and reread the words that described her husband as responsible for the deaths of 3 men. "Now you understand," said Catherine softly, "why I believed I should tell you. James carries the guilt of those deaths. That's why he went to Montana, that's why he lives so isolated. He's running from what he did." Mary Elizabeth couldn't speak. All the pieces began to fall into place. James's reluctance to talk about his past, his conviction that he didn't deserve love, his surprise when she had chosen to stay with him. "Are you sure this is the same James Harper?" "Completely. When I saw the announcement of your marriage in the newspaper, I recognized the name and location immediately." Mary Elizabeth carefully folded the clipping and returned it to Catherine. "Why are you telling me this? What do you gain?" Catherine smiled, but it was a sad smile. "Nothing. I've already rebuilt a life in Denver. I have a prosperous business, even a respectable suitor. But when I read about your marriage, I couldn't bear the idea that another woman would be deceived as I was." "Deceived? How?" "James is a good man in many ways, but he carries a guilt that makes him incapable of being completely honest, completely present. He'll live his whole life punishing himself for what happened in that mine, and any woman who loves him will live in the shadow of that guilt." Mary Elizabeth stood, feeling as if she needed fresh air. "Thank you for telling me this. I know. It wasn't easy. What will you do?" It was the question Mary Elizabeth had been avoiding since she had read the clipping. "I don't know. I need time to think." The trip back to Willow Creek was torture. Mary Elizabeth found herself questioning everything she believed she knew about her marriage, about James, about herself. Could she love a man who had caused the deaths of others? Could she build a life with someone who had hidden something so fundamental about who he was? But more painful still, could she live, knowing that perhaps he had never loved her completely because he believed he didn't deserve to be loved? When she finally reached the ranch, the sun was setting behind the mountains painting, the sky in shades of pink and gold. James was waiting for her on the porch, and the anxiety on his face was evident even from a distance. "Where have you been?" he asked when she got down from the wagon. "William said you had gone shopping, but when you didn't return—" "I needed to think," she said simply. James studied her, and Mary Elizabeth saw the moment when he realized something had changed fundamentally. "What happened?" Mary Elizabeth looked into his eyes, these grey eyes she had learned to trust, which she had believed held no important secrets. "James," she said softly, "we need to talk." And in the silence that followed, both knew their marriage was about to face its most difficult test. Could love survive the truth? Or were their secrets so deep they could destroy even the strongest bonds? The main room of the house she had come to consider her home felt like foreign territory when Mary Elizabeth and James sat facing each other that night. William had dined with them, filling the tense silence with accounts of his plans for the return trip, apparently oblivious to the emotional storm brewing between the spouses. Now, with William retired to his guest room, Mary Elizabeth and James faced each other in a silence that weighed like lead between them. "Are you going to tell me what's happening?" asked James finally, and there was something in his voice that suggested he already knew the news wouldn't be good. Mary Elizabeth had practiced this moment during the entire trip back, had rehearsed the words, had imagined different ways to approach what she had discovered. But now, looking at the man she loved, all her preparations crumbled. "I met someone. Today, in Billings." James tensed like an animal that sensed danger. "Who?" "Catherine Morrison." The name hit James like a physical blow. Mary Elizabeth saw how all the blood drained from his face, how his hands gripped the arms of the armchair, as if he needed to anchor himself to keep from falling. "Catherine is here," he said, and it wasn't a question, but a statement loaded with horror. "She was. She left this afternoon, but not before telling me some very interesting things about your past." James closed his eyes, as if feeling physical pain. "Mary Elizabeth, tell me about the mine, James. Tell me about the 3 men who died." The silence that followed was so absolute that Mary Elizabeth could hear the beating of her own heart, the tick-tock of the clock on the mantelpiece, the night wind whispering through the cottonwoods. When James finally opened his eyes, there was a desolation in them so deep that Mary Elizabeth felt as if she were looking into a bottomless well. "What did she tell you exactly?" "That you were an engineer at a mine near Denver, that you modified the safety plans to speed up the operation, that your decision caused a collapse that killed 3 men. James stood abruptly, walking to the window as if he couldn't bear to be sitting. "And what else? That's why you live here, that you're running from what you did. That's why you believed you couldn't marry her, that you didn't deserve to be loved. And what do you believe?" The question hung in the air between them like a knife blade. Mary Elizabeth also stood but kept her distance. "I believe I need to hear your version of the facts." James rested his hands on the windowsill, his silhouette outlined against the starry sky. When he spoke, his voice sounded as if it came from a great distance. "I was 23 years old, fresh out of university, full of ideas about efficiency and innovation. They hired me to design a tunnel system that would extract more ore in less time." He stopped, and Mary Elizabeth could see the tension in every line of his body. "The original plans called for wooden supports every 6 feet. I calculated that we could extend that distance to 8 feet without compromising safety. It would mean less material, less time, more profits for the company. And I was wrong." The words came out like a confession torn from the deepest part of his soul. The tunnel collapsed in the 3rd week. Thomas McKenna, 28 years old, married 2 small children. Michael O'Brien, 19 years old, had just started working to support his widowed mother. Joseph Martinez, 35 years old, had 5 children. James turned to her, and Mary Elizabeth saw he had tears in his eyes. "I know their names, Mary Elizabeth. I know the ages of their children. I know that Thomas's wife died 2 years later, apparently of grief. I know that Michael's mother lost her house because he was her only support. I know that Joseph's children had to work at 12 years old because their father had died because of my arrogance." Mary Elizabeth felt as if someone were squeezing her heart with an iron hand. "James, for 2 years after the accident, I sent money to their families. Everything I earned. I lived in a boarding house room, ate one meal a day, and sent the rest to try to pay a debt I can never fully repay. That's why you came here. I came here to disappear, to live a life that didn't matter to anyone, to make sure my decisions could never again hurt innocent people. He approached her but stopped several feet away, as if he no longer had the right to touch her. Catherine was right. I'm cursed, Mary Elizabeth. Everything I touch, everything I love, I eventually destroy. That's why I tried to keep my distance from you at first. That's why the marriage was going to be temporary. Because I knew that if I let you get too close, if I allowed you to love me, I would find a way to destroy your happiness too. Mary Elizabeth looked at him through the tears, now flowing freely down her cheeks. And why didn't you tell me this before? Why did you let me fall in love with you without knowing who you really were? Because I'm a coward. Because when you started looking at me as if I were worthy of love, when you started touching the parts of me I had believed dead, I couldn't bear the idea of seeing that change to horror. Like it's changing now. Mary Elizabeth stopped, really considering the question. Was it changing? Did she look at James differently now that she knew the truth? Yes, but not in the way he feared. James, look at me. He raised his eyes reluctantly, as if expecting to see rejection and disgust. How old are you now? 29. So you were 23 when the accident happened. 6 years. You've been punishing yourself for 6 years for a mistake in judgment you made when you were young and inexperienced. A mistake that killed 3 men. A mistake that a young engineer made trying to do his job better. Did you modify those plans out of greed, out of carelessness to hurt someone? No, but did you modify them because you honestly believed it would be safe to do so? James didn't answer, but Mary Elizabeth could see the answer in his eyes. James, what happened was terrible. Tragic. Those families suffered losses that can never be replaced. But punishing yourself forever, denying yourself the possibility of happiness, of love, of a full life, that doesn't bring those men back. That doesn't help their families. That just adds one more destroyed life to the cost of that tragedy. How can you say that? How can you look at me knowing what I did and not see me as the monster I am? Mary. Elizabeth approached him, ignoring how he instinctively recoiled. Because I know you, James Harper. I've lived with you, I've seen your soul. I've seen how you treat injured animals, how you care for this land, how you loved me with a tenderness that undoes me. The man who does those things isn't a monster. He's a man who made a terrible mistake and has spent years trying to atone for it. It's not enough. What would be enough? How many years of self-punishment? How many opportunities for happiness rejected? How many acts of kindness and service? What would you have to do to earn the right to be human again? James looked at her as if the question were impossible to answer. I don't know. Then maybe it's time to stop punishing yourself and start living in a way that honors those men. Maybe it's time to use the guilt you feel to be better, to do good in the world, to make sure their deaths weren't completely in vain. She moved closer, and this time he didn't pull back. I love you, James. I love the man you are now, shaped by this tragedy, but not destroyed by it. I love your compassion, your care, your determination to never hurt anyone again. If you hadn't lived through that experience, if you hadn't learned from that terrible mistake, maybe you wouldn't be the man I fell in love with. Mary Elizabeth, you can't. I can. And I do. She took his face in her hands. James Harper, I forgive you for not telling me the truth before. I forgive you for trying to protect me from your past. But more importantly, I want you to learn to forgive yourself. I don't know how. We'll learn together. She kissed him softly. Because that's what spouses do. They help each other heal, grow, be better than they could be alone. James embraced her then, and Mary Elizabeth felt how years of tension released from his body like water breaking through a dam. I love you, he murmured against her hair. I love you so much it terrifies me. And I love you, all of you. Even the broken parts you think should be kept hidden. They stayed like that, embraced in the main room of their home, while the night wind sang through the cottonwoods and the stars shone over the valley that had brought them together. But Mary Elizabeth knew that although they had overcome this crisis, although love had proven stronger than the secrets of the past, there was still a crucial question to answer. Could they build a future on complete honesty? Or would there be more? Secrets waiting to emerge. Spring came early to Willow Creek that year, as if the earth itself was celebrating the love that had blossomed among its golden hills. Mary Elizabeth found herself in the garden, planting seeds she had specially ordered for this season. Sunflowers for joy, lavender for tranquility, and roses for the enduring beauty of true love. 6 months had passed since the night James had revealed the darkest secrets of his past 6 months, since they had decided to build their future on the unshakable foundation of complete honesty. It hadn't been easy. There were nights when James woke with nightmares, days when guilt overwhelmed him like a dark tide. But there were also mornings full of hope, afternoons of laughter, and nights when the love they shared seemed strong enough to heal all the world's wounds. Planting dreams again. The familiar voice startled her from her thoughts. Mary Elizabeth turned to find James watching her from the garden's edge, and as always her heart raced at seeing him. Winter had been kind to him. The lines of tension around his eyes had softened, and there was a peace in his posture that hadn't been there before. Planting the future, she corrected, standing and brushing dirt from her hands. How is the new mare? Perfect. And her foal, too. He approached to help her gather the tools. Dr. Williams said he'd never seen such an easy birth. They had expanded the ranch during the winter, buying more horses, improving the stables. James had discovered he had a gift for training difficult animals, and his reputation had spread throughout the county. It was work that brought him satisfaction without the risks that had terrified him in his previous career. "There's something I want to show you," said Mary Elizabeth, taking his hand. She guided him to the end of the garden where she had been working in secret for the past few weeks. There, in a sunny corner, protected by a white wooden fence, she had planted 3 small fruit trees. "What is this?" asked James, though his voice suggested he already knew. "A memorial. For Thomas, Michael, and Joseph." She gently touched the metal plaque she had commissioned in town. "Their names will be here forever, and every spring when the trees bloom, we'll remember that life can emerge even from the deepest sorrow." James knelt before the plaque, reading the carefully engraved names, "In memory of Thomas McKenna, Michael O'Brien, and Joseph Martinez. May their lives not have been in vain, and may their families find peace." "Mary Elizabeth," he murmured, and there were tears in his voice. "You didn't." "Need to—" "Yes, I did. They're part of our story, too. Part of what made you the man you are. We can't change the past, but we can honor it. We can make sure it meant something." James embraced her then, and Mary Elizabeth felt they had finally found a way to carry the past without it destroying them. "There's something else," said James when they separated. "A letter arrived this morning." He pulled an envelope from his shirt pocket, and Mary Elizabeth immediately recognized her brother's elegant handwriting. "Dear Mary Elizabeth and James, I hope this letter finds you well and happy. News of your successes with the ranch has reached Charleston, and I must admit I feel proud of my sister's accomplishments. I write to inform you that I have decided to invest in cattle development in Montana. I have purchased land near Billings and plan to establish a considerable operation there. This means I will be spending at least half the year in your beautiful state. I also write to apologize, Mary Elizabeth. I made a mistake in not trusting your judgment from the beginning. You found exactly the life you needed with exactly the man you deserve. James, consider yourself officially welcomed into the Sullivan family. Finally, I have news I believe will please you. Catherine Morrison married last month to a Denver banker. Apparently, she finally found the peace she had been seeking. She specifically asked me to send you both her best wishes for your future together. With all my love and respect, William. P.S. Aunt Margaret insists on sending you an appropriate wedding gift. Expect a considerable box on the next stagecoach. Mary Elizabeth laughed, feeling as if a final weight had been lifted from her shoulders. Do you know what this means? She asked. That your Aunt Margaret is going to send enough porcelain to supply a hotel. That we're truly free. Free from the past. Free from others' judgments. Free to build the life we want. James looked at her with that expression of amazement that still appeared on his face when he realized his happiness was real. And what kind of life do we want? Mary Elizabeth smiled, placing her hand over the place where she knew would soon begin to show evidence of the new life they were creating together. A life full of love. A life that honors the past but doesn't live prisoner to it. A life where children can play under these trees and learn about compassion, about forgiveness, about the value of choosing love over fear. James followed her, gazed to her hand, and his eyes widened with understanding. Mary Elizabeth. Yes, in the fall. He kissed her, then a kiss that tasted of fulfilled promises and dreams yet to be realized. When they separated, both were laughing and crying at the same time. That night, as they prepared for sleep in the room they now shared completely, James stopped before the mirror, where Mary Elizabeth was brushing her hair. "Do you ever regret it?" he asked. "Choosing this instead of the life you could have had in Charleston?" Mary Elizabeth put down the brush and turned to him. "James Harper, do you know what the happiest day of my life was? Our real wedding? No, though that's in second place." She smiled. "It was the day I stepped down from that stagecoach and saw you for the first time, because that was the day my real life began." She approached him, taking his hands in hers. "In Charleston, I was like an actress playing a role that never fit right. Here with you, I'm who I was supposed to be from the beginning. I'm Mary Elizabeth Harper. I'm a wife, a gardener, a member of a community that accepts me for who I am, and soon I'll be a mother. And is that enough? It's everything." Epilogue. The Golden Future. 2 years later, Mary Elizabeth found herself in the same garden, watching her 1-year-old daughter chase a butterfly among the flowers, while James taught their 6-month-old son to take his first wobbly steps. The memorial trees had grown their branches, extending gentle shade over the plaque that honored men they had never known, but whose lives had deeply touched theirs. Mrs. McKinnon had come to visit them, as she did every Sunday after church, bringing fresh gossip from town and homemade pies. "Did you know Reverend Porter finally proposed to the new teacher?" she announced as she served tea. "The whole community is excited. It'll be the wedding of the year." "How wonderful," replied Mary Elizabeth, rescuing her daughter before she decided the roses needed to be tasted. "And more families have arrived from the east. Apparently word has spread about our little paradise here." Mrs. McKinnon looked meaningfully at Mary Elizabeth. "After all, if a refined Charleston lady can flourish here, others have decided maybe they can too." "This place changes people," said Mary Elizabeth, watching James play with their son. "It helps them discover who they really are." "Or maybe you two changed the place." Mrs. McKinnon smiled. "You brought something special here. Hope, perhaps. Proof that love can overcome any obstacle." That night, after the children had fallen asleep and Mrs. McKinnon had departed, Mary Elizabeth and James sat on the porch, as they had done thousands of times, watching the stars over the valley that had brought them together. "What are you thinking about?" asked James, noticing her contemplative silence. "About how strange fate is. If I hadn't been a shameful spinster in Charleston, William never would have sent me here. If you hadn't had to carry the guilt of the past, maybe you never would have been available to care for your friend's problematic sister. If Charles hadn't been so arrogant, maybe we never would have needed a marriage of convenience. Does it bother you that so many painful things had to happen to bring us together?" Mary Elizabeth considered the question seriously. "No, because each of those painful things taught us something we needed to know. Your tragedy taught you compassion. My social isolation taught me to value genuine connection. Charles's malicious gossip taught us to fight for what we love. And what did we learn in the end? That true love isn't something that just happens. It's something we choose day after day, moment by moment. It's something we fight for, something we cultivate, something we protect and nurture like a garden." James took her hand, intertwining their fingers with the familiarity born of years of shared love. "Mary Elizabeth Harper, would you choose me again? If you could go back knowing everything you know now, would you take that stagecoach to Willow Creek?" She turned to him, seeing in his face the lines that time and experience had etched there, the gray hairs beginning to appear at his temples, the wrinkles around his eyes that spoke of years of shared smiles. "James Harper, I would choose you in any life, at any time, under any circumstances, because with you I learned that home isn't a place, it's a person, and you are my home." They kissed under Montana's stars, surrounded by the sound of cottonwoods, whispering secrets of love to the night wind. In the distance, an owl called to its mate, and somewhere in the valley new love stories were beginning. Because in Willow Creek, where love had once bloomed against all odds, people had learned to believe in miracles. They had learned that sometimes the most beautiful endings emerge from the most unlikely beginnings, and that true love can transform even the most temporary arrangements into eternal promises. And as Mary Elizabeth fell asleep that night, in the arms of the man she had chosen, whom she had fought to keep, whom she had loved, through secrets and revelations, through storms and calm, she knew with absolute certainty that she had lived exactly the life she was meant to live.